A major consequence of the populist movement was its impact on race relations in the South, and Texas was no exception. Both the Farmers' Alliance and the Populist Party included black members in order to strengthen their numbers and increase political influence. Conservative Southern Democrats viewed this interracial political cooperation as a threat and responded by establishing the Jim Crow system. Jim Crow differed from the informal racial separation that existed immediately after the Civil War. Before Jim Crow, formerly enslaved people generally understood where they could safely exist within towns, and segregation was enforced primarily through custom rather than law. Jim Crow laws originated in the transportation industry, particularly the railroads, as they expanded across the South. Initially, railroad companies sold first-class tickets to anyone who could afford them, regardless of race. These tickets generated the majority of railroad revenue. Over time, however, white families grew increasingly uneasy about the possibility of white women riding alongside people of other races. Southern legislatures responded by attempting to require railroads to provide separate first-class accommodations. Railroad companies resisted these laws because maintaining additional railcars increased operating expenses. Nevertheless, in 1889, Texas followed Louisiana's lead by mandating separate accommodations for different races on railroads. This legislation marked the beginning of legally enforced segregation in Texas. Segregation was only one aspect of the Jim Crow system. Southern Democrats were also deeply concerned about black political participation. Although the end of Reconstruction had eliminated Republican governments in the South, black voting persisted, and the populist movement mobilized black voters in even greater numbers. Southern Democrats therefore sought methods to restrict voting while avoiding direct violations of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Those amendments prohibited denying the vote based on race, but did not prevent states from imposing restrictions related to taxes or literacy. One such restriction was the poll tax. Voters were required to pay a fee to vote, generally ranging from 50 cents to $3.50. Although the tax was relatively small, it placed voting out of reach for many poor Americans, both black and white. The poll tax was also cumulative, meaning that failure to pay it 1 year required payment of past and current taxes before voting rights could be restored. Another method of disfranchisement was the adoption of the Australian ballot. Prior to this reform, voting was a public act, with voters placing a paper into a container representing their chosen candidate. The Australian ballot introduced secret voting, requiring voters to read and understand the ballot. Southern states then implemented literacy tests. These tests were administered by local officials who had broad discretion over who passed. In practice, white voters could pass despite limited literacy, while black voters could be denied, even if they read perfectly. Together, these measures dramatically reduced black voter participation throughout the South. Jim Crow was enforced not only through law, but also through violence. Severe punishments were imposed on anyone accused of violating racial norms, often regardless of guilt or innocence. The most extreme form of this punishment was lynching. Lynching served not only to punish the accused, but also to terrorize entire communities by making victims into examples. Texas became one of the leading states in lynchings carried out by white mobs against black men. One of the most infamous examples occurred in Sherman, Texas, in 1930. George Hughes, a black man, was accused of raping a white woman. Hughes confessed, and while awaiting trial, rumors intensified the allegations, claiming that the woman had been mutilated and was dying. On May 9, 1930, a crowd gathered at the courthouse where Hughes was being held. As the trial proceeded, the crowd broke into the courtroom, forcing Texas Rangers to use tear gas in an attempt to restore order. Later that afternoon, the courthouse was set on fire. Hughes was moved to a fireproof vault for his safety, while members of the mob cut fire hoses to prevent the fire department from responding. Governor Dan Moody ordered the National Guard to intervene, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by the mob. Eventually, the crowd breached the vault using dynamite and welding torches. Hughes was found dead inside, likely from smoke inhalation. Dissatisfied, the mob dragged his body through the streets, hung it, and set it on fire in the downtown business district. The violence continued as the mob destroyed much of Sherman's black business district and prevented firefighters from stopping the destruction. By the morning of May 10th, much of the area lay in ruins. Because the black undertaker's business had been destroyed, Hughes was buried by a white undertaker in an unmarked grave. Only one individual was convicted in connection with the riot, and that conviction was for arson and rioting, not for the lynching itself. Such outcomes were typical. Between 1882 and 1968, at least 493 people were lynched in Texas, 352 of whom, approximately 71%, were black. Only Georgia and Mississippi recorded higher numbers. Lynching represented the most brutal and visible enforcement mechanism of the Jim Crow system.